In the revolutionary era of the 1960s, two scientists, Martin Seligman and Harry Harlow, embarked on a groundbreaking experiment that would reshape human psychology. Dogs and monkeys became the brave subjects of their study, facing challenges that would test their resilience and invoke a spectrum of emotions. Electric shocks that sent shivers down their spines, confinement in cages that stifled their freedom, and the heart-wrenching separation of baby monkeys from their loving mothers. Their sacrificial journey has left an indelible impact on modern psychiatry, laying the foundation for understanding stress, trauma, attachment, and loss of control in the human brain.
In order to understand the effects of stress, including separation, let's go back in time and look at the concept of learned helplessness, which Seligman studied, and Harlow's experiments that looked at the reaction to separation. First, let's look at learned helplessness. The failure to escape shock induced by uncontrollable aversive events, which was really this learned helplessness experiment. This was discovered half a century ago by Seligman and Meyer in 1967. Now, this is what the experiment looked like. Dogs were divided into three groups, and they were in hammocks. First, one group gets an escapable shock. This group of dogs they were in the hammock, they learned to press a panel with their noses to turn off the shock. The first group of dogs, they're able to escape. The second group was the inescapable group. Here, the dog's responses have no effect on the shock. No matter what they did, the shock doesn't stop. So this is the inescapable group. So the third group gets no shock. Now, after this, the dogs were moved to a device known as the shuttle box. The box consisted of two compartments, which was divided by a knee-high barrier so that the dogs could basically jump and escape. So we had three groups: escapable, inescapable, and no shock. Now, this is what happened. Really striking. 2/3 of the animals from the inescapable group failed to learn to escape, whereas 90% of the animals in both the escapable and no shock groups easily learned to escape. Importantly, the escape dogs and the no shock group learned to escape equally well. It's almost like the majority of the inescapable dogs basically went passive and accepted the hopelessness or the helplessness, the inescapable fate. Now, besides this, a number of other behavioral changes also happened, particularly in this inescapable group. I'd like us to think about connecting these behaviors to humans so that we can see the parallels. Some of these behaviors were reduced aggression, reduced social dominance, reduced food and water intake, exaggerated attention to external cues, reduced preference for novelty behaviors, so exploration, for example, and slowed fear extinction as well, which basically meant lots of sort of heightened responses. So what this is telling us is that in the context of stresses that we can't really control, one can enter into a reward deficit state, which is really similar to the inescapable dogs. And this reward deficit state essentially is linked to hopelessness. But it also sets up a cascade for self-medication where the individual then could seek substances to receive that reward. Let's now look at the neurobiology of the symptoms. As we look at these stages, I'd like you to think about the similarities again with the human experience. Now here, the main circuits that were postulated to be involved was the dorsal raphe nucleus, the amygdala, connection to the frontal cortex. Now we know that the dorsal raphe nucleus has serotonin neurons, and this particular serotonin neurons, the dorsal raphe nucleus, mediates two key aspects. Serotonin that's released in the PAG, there's an area known as PAG, which is periaqueductal gray, and the striatums responsible for movements. So what happens here is that when serotonin's released in PAG and the striatum, it inhibits active escape behavior. So one moves into what's called passivity. When we're exposed to stress, we have a certain passivity at the beginning. We may experience this anxiety, But then we have mechanisms to reduce this, and this happens through the release of GABA at the 5-HT2A receptors, which reduces hyperarousal of the amygdala. The issue arises with prolonged stresses, where we just can't reduce the external stressor, almost like that the shocks being received by the dog, where no matter what I do, I continue to receive the shock. And this results in the dysregulation of this anxiety or fear controlling mechanism. The next anxiety aspect, so passivity anxiety, we have fight and flight. So any stressor gives us the fight and flight. And this is exactly the noradrenergic potentiation that's required. It makes sure that we remember the threat, but we're also able to escape from this. When there's excessive stress, this will result in sensitization and therefore poor escape, but ongoing heightened anxiety. This is what would happen in humans as well, where acute stress will result in a fight and flight response that can be adaptive, but prolonged stress will take us down a pathway towards passivity with heightened anxiety. And that's a very, very unpleasant state to be. The excitation of the dorsal raphe nucleus is necessary and sufficient for this passivity and heightened fear. So we have now detect circuits and act circuits that actually come into play. When a shock is initially escapable, what happens is these dogs, just like humans, would have detected the presence of control, which basically means I can escape, and that means they can either jump over that barrier, or here they were able to activate that lever to stop the shocks from occurring. Similarly, as human beings, when we initially have the stresses, we will detect the issue and then act to solve it. Essentially, the amygdala has neurons from the dorsal raphe area where we have serotonin, noradrenaline neurons as well, and also dopamine neurons. Now, these amygdala neurons, these different neurotransmitters, they project to the frontal cortex, specifically to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this ventromedial prefrontal cortex amygdala connection is really what provides the detection of control. And this becomes crucial towards then the feeling of hope, the fact that I can escape, I can reduce stresses. So the initial anxiety increases noradrenaline and dopamine from the amygdala, which mediates the detect phase. The circuit involved here is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the dorsal medial striatum. Now, this DMS, dorsal medial striatum, is the goal-directed part of our brain. But the VMPFC, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, also has inhibitory connections to the amygdala. And this circuit is the corticostriatal limbic circuit, also known as the frontostriatal limbic circuit. Now, this particular circuit is involved in depression, OCD, in regulation of sleep, regulation of pain, PTSD. So it's basically trans-diagnostic. We also know that the striatum has a ventral part, and this ventral part is known as the nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens is where dopamine is released for us to experience pleasure. But it also mediates aversion. So for example, when we have an aversive response, dopamine release will be sort of decreased, teaches us that this is aversive response. This is not something I'm going to go towards later on. So we have ventral striatum, nucleus accumbens for reward experience, goal-directed striatum, which is the dorsomedial striatum, and then we have the habit striatum, which is the dorsolateral striatum. So these three combine for us to experience reward and of course make actions or put things into place moving further. This ventromedial prefrontal cortex to the amygdala is the same connection or network which is involved in post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's why we have two phenotypes. If you are a clinician wanting to learn a lot more about PTSD in a very structured manner, don't forget to visit the Academy, academy.psychscene.com, where of course you can delve into this in a lot more detail, of course test your knowledge, download PDFs, and go into all of these aspects and make connections and discover a lot more. Check it out, and of course take your learning to the next level if you are a clinician looking for something like that. So what we've got first was passivity anxiety, 2, detect and act, and 3rd, expect. And this is exactly what Seligman outlined in the paper, is what I'm covering. After the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, dorsal raphe nucleus act circuit is activated, there are a set of changes, neuroplastic changes that occur that then result in changing the way we think about future stressful situations. So in other words, what's happened to us in the past influences what we do in the future. So this ventromedial prefrontal cortex to amygdala circuit undergoes neuroplastic changes to form now an expectation of control. This process is important because the events that happen now, as I said, will impact the future. They will change or bias the way we feel. If we've had a negative experience in the past where we've not been able to control a single situation, the same situation may be more fearful for us and may not be able to actually change it. So therefore, what we've got to recognize is control over the outcome is ultimately a reward. If control's obtained, a reward's experienced. When a reward's experienced, we know dopamine's released. The actions that we took that led to the reward are consolidated, which is exactly what we call reward learning. And those actions can now be used the next time. And what it also does is not only use those actions that are consolidated that led to, say, maybe one stress or problem-solving approach, but it actually creates the expectation for any other stresses. And the cognitive belief that's formed is I can deal with this stressful situation. So the action from the past led to the expectation that stressful situations are modifiable. This circuit, which gives the individual the presence of control, was coined as the hope circuit by Seligman. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to the amygdala is the hope circuit. And this is exactly the sort of aspect that we are going to try to activate in patients that experience helplessness. What are the barriers that prevent me from making a difference to individuals? One, chronic and inescapable stress. This leads to sensitization of the 5-HT receptors and can result in chronic and heightened anxiety, along with that passivity aspect. So the detect and act phase, we don't get there. Two, activation of noradrenergic neurons. Now, chronic hyperarousal results in noradrenergic dysfunction. And why does that happen? It's because there is so much noradrenaline being released from the locus ceruleus that it results in depletion of noradrenaline. So the production does not keep pace with how much is being released. And therefore, there is an endogenous noradrenergic deficiency. Paradoxically, an endogenous noradrenergic deficit further increases noradrenaline. Why? Because the presynaptic end of the neuron that normally has a break will actually further release noradrenaline. Because normally, when we have enough noradrenaline in the synaptic cleft, the presynaptic neuron acts as a brake. But when we don't have enough, the brake will be lifted, thus resulting in a compensatory increase in noradrenaline, increasing anxiety, arousal, and agitation. So this is really paradoxical. We know that increased noradrenaline is detrimental to prefrontal cortex functioning and hence will impact on the detect and act phase. So decision-making is impaired. Alpha-1 receptor stimulation leads to cognitive inflexibility and impulsive decision-making. So besides the subcortical emotional limbic arousal, inactivation of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex or the dorsal medial striatum, the goal-directed area, prevents learning. So responses here sort of can be learned, but what happens is only the habit system is used. So therefore, the steps that we're taking, we're not actively consolidating or learning. So it makes it difficult for the individual in the future to deal with any uncertainty because these particular behaviors, these particular aspects of learning were not consolidated. So we move towards a habit type behavioral approach rather than a really goal-directed behavioral approach. Now, interestingly, in Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, Things That Gain from Disorder, he talks about anti-fragility as a concept. Anti-fragility is different from robustness. So robustness is where there is a certain amount of, say, resilience. The individual's able to withhold or withstand, rather, stresses or what's coming towards them. Anti-fragility is a concept whereby things become stronger when subjected to volatility or shocks or stress. It's beyond being robust. It's not only withstanding stress, but becoming stronger from stress. Thus, it's important that we're exposed to a certain amount of uncertainty as adolescents or adults, and to be able to learn to deal with uncertainty. Small doses sort of make us stronger, the concept of hormesis. but at the same time, too much is likely to be detrimental. Similarly, fasting is beneficial as it increases brain activity, dopamine, etc., BDNF, but starvation is of course counterproductive. So a little bit, say intermittent fasting, etc., is beneficial. Starvation, of course, isn't. It's important here to recognize that fragility and anti-fragility in humans from a mental health perspective comes down to individual variability. So it's not sufficient for me to say that everyone is able to deal with stresses the same way as I would expect it to or someone else would expect it to. This individual variability is linked to genes, childhood experiences, medical condition, current life stresses, coping strategies, modifiable versus non-modifiable stresses, all of which can affect the circuits involved in dealing with stress and uncertainty. Therefore, for someone to propose a single solution for all issues linked to mental health or psychiatric disorders, for example, a diet to deal with depression, or exercise or mindfulness or meditation for all trauma patients, or saying that medication is not needed, you can do this through meditation or mindfulness or exercise, paradoxically highlights a lack of knowledge to whoever's proposing this, because it's actually highlighting the Dunning-Kruger effect, whereby with advancing knowledge, one recognizes that the human body, the brain, all the experiences that we have, it's complex, and thus one requires a really broader frame, a broader problem-solving approach, taking multiple factors and then integrating it and then individualizing it to that particular individual in front of you. What worked for one person may not work for others. In solving an issue, especially a mental health issue, it's important to know not only what works, but also what doesn't, and what may increase fragility, so to say, and what may decrease it, for example. In the animal experiments, the concept of stress-induced hormesis played out, whereby the initial exposure to escapable shock prevented or reduced the passivity anxiety induced by a later inescapable shock, a phenomenon called immunization. This is from Meyer et al., 1969. So absolutely fascinating, whereby what happened during the first stressful situation really made a difference to how they responded to the future situation. Hence why, if we backtrack, childhood experiences, childhood trauma really shape what happens in the future. Does not mean we can't intervene, but it's important for us to know this particular phenomenon, because sometimes we may compare ourselves to others, and what worked for someone else, as I mentioned, may not work for another person. So to summarize this particular aspect, the experiment with dogs, learned helplessness in a way, we know that this isn't learned. This is a really primitive response. And what we want to do is to activate the hope circuit, and the hope circuit depends on what we've experienced in the past. It is something that can be modified, and that's where we come in. But passivity is a core phenomenon that occurs in all of us when we're exposed to stress. It's really the detection and the action that leads to the change in expectation in the future.
Let me show you a monkey raised on a nursing wire mother.
Here, they studied the behavioral responses to separation in baby monkeys. Now, this separation from a human perspective can be translated to stress or grief or loss. So what were the behaviors that were seen when the baby was initially separated from the mother? The initial reaction to the sudden disappearance of the mother included frequent, loud, repetitive, sad and mournful calls. The monkeys showed disturbed behavior. They stared blankly, circling their cages, and engaged in self-mutilation. Now, this repeated vocalizations or shouting or cooing, etc., along with high levels of locomotor activity, so circling around in cages, is really a way of wanting to get that reward, which is basically, in this case, reunion with the mother. But what is happening here, if we think about from a brain perspective, there is amygdala activation, which has led to anxiety. The mother's not there. The prefrontal cortex has detected that loss. The striatum, the action part, now has to act, which is really what's happening, the shouting or the screaming or the cooing. In some cases, what's happening here, self-mutilation. Why? Because self-harm increases opioids. The opioids goes and acts on the nucleus accumbens to release dopamine. So it's, in a way, self-medication to increase dopamine, to experience reward when one is not able to experience reward. In humans, This is the initial anxiety that people will experience with separation, stress, loss, grief, etc. And then what happens? The striatum, the decision-making, the actions will be implemented to solve the problem, which basically means obtaining a reward. When the problem's solved, there is reduction of anxiety because the stress has now gone away. What happens, backtracking again to the baby monkey? The baby calms down to a certain extent, but then any stimuli that basically are linked to that separation triggers off the whole train of emotional responses again. For example, when the baby has to go to sleep, during nighttime again or sleep time, there is a striking increase in crying and agitation. Over the next few days, the pattern shifts from agitation towards where the baby withdraws. This is where one can see the transition from psychomotor agitation towards withdrawal, which ultimately, if it continues, moves towards what we call psychomotor retardation. So here the baby withdraws from the environment almost completely. And now what happens is all that activity, agitation is actually directed towards oneself. So the baby moves all of that inwards. This is exactly what we see in severe depression in humans as well. Initially, any stresses may start off with anxiety, but ongoing non-resolution of stresses, which basically means no matter what I do, I am not getting the reward that my actions would normally give me. So therefore, there's no presence of control. There is an inactivation of the hope circuit. This leads to excessive amygdala activation, reduced prefrontal cortex control. This cascade leads to anxiety moving towards hyperarousal, excessive noradrenergic activity, then agitation, which is exactly what we saw when the monkeys were circling around in the cages or self-harming. Increased dopamine activity in the mesolimbic system, which is associated again with salience abnormalities. When salience becomes significantly disturbed, that's when psychosis can occur. So what do we have here now? We've got prefrontal cortex abnormalities, striatal abnormalities. There is good evidence that long-term exposure to psychosocial adverse situations is associated with decreased dopaminergic function in the striatum. So people move towards a psychomotor retarded state or an amotivational state as a result of this almost dopamine deficit. Now, childhood trauma also leads to a dopamine deficit state. So now what we've got, there's been no activation of the hope circuit, no presence of control, no reward. And that's when the monkey enters into what's known as a despair or depression phase. So initially there were lots of protests, lots of activity, but then they moved towards losing virtually all interest in the world around them. A complete sort of shutdown. And this is what we see in humans as well, sort of a frontostriatal shutdown. In some cases, it can be so extreme that the individual can present with what's known as catatonic depression. Stop eating, stop drinking, complete social withdrawal, and entire sort of internal ruminations. Here, in the baby monkey, they found that they would not initiate play nor respond to the efforts of others. Even if a new object was introduced, which normally would be of great excitement to the baby monkeys, this did not interest them or arouse them. The other interesting thing that happened here is self-soothing strategies were thumb sucking, genital manipulation, and self-clasping. A reward deficit state is transdiagnostic across a range of disorders, depression, ADHD, substance use, impulse dysregulation disorders. Now note how that genital manipulation, self-soothing behaviors, attempts to counteract the reward deficiency state were used by the monkeys. As I mentioned in humans, this would mirror substance use or maladaptive ways through food, sex, drugs, etc. This is ultimately linked to dopamine and noradrenaline dysfunction. So in humans, what do we see? We see anhedonia, amotivation. We see striatal dopamine dysfunction. And in reward deficient states, individuals may actually use substances in order to cope. Similar sort of things happen in eating disorders, which is also known as a reward deficit state. So what we've seen is the depression phase, and this particular, which is linked to reward deficit, then moves towards what's known as a detachment phase, which is social isolation. And interestingly, even after some infants had shown some relative recovery in the mother's absence, what happened was when the mother returned, each time they went into the depressive pattern, which really mirrors what happens with triggers, trauma triggers in humans, that a trauma response can set off the cascade significantly, just like it did in the baby monkeys, really pointing towards a very primitive response. So this is not something that necessarily is learned, but a primitive response arising from the subcortical parts of the brain. As clinicians, our aim is to activate the hope circuit. Treatment strategies need to consider the severity of the dysfunction, inhibition of the amygdala, and the strength of the hope circuit. Treatment can only buffer against past and present events. It's about the anticipation of reward that matters most. So therefore, in treatment as well, clinicians should think about how to move the person towards a state of control and thus be able to experience reward. As psychiatrists, we can use appropriate psychopharmacology and recognize appropriate stage-based psychological treatments to implement a range of treatments to help the person in their journey towards future mastery for the patient. Another important thing to consider is that psychotherapy, particularly with trauma, in some cases, just simply spending time on the trauma in mindfulness or meditation, etc., where we're looking at the individual obtaining control, the detect is important, but the action, the act is important because it's the act that then results in the future expectation of control. So the main messages are the following. Seligman said the neural circuitry underlying the phenomenon of learned helplessness strongly suggests that helplessness was not learned. Rather, passivity and heightened anxiety are default reactions. What can be learned is that uncontrollable stress can be controllable in the future. 2, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the striatal limbic system, is core to the symptoms of learned helplessness, but also depression in humans. The aim is to learn how to control future bad events, because once we do that, we have the expectation with all of the other stresses that future unexpected or negative events are controllable. So with that in mind, make sure you do hit the like button if you liked the video, but also let us know, in the comment section what additional topics you want. A big thank you to all of you for, of course, supporting the channel, and look forward to doing lots more videos for you as well. So take care and stay psyched. All right, bye-bye.